Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're just letting everybody into the webinar, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're just letting all participants into the webinar, and we'll be getting underway in just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting from Treaty 1 territory today. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today virtually to celebrate the publication of the Prairie Garden 2023, Climate Aware Gardening. You'll be hearing from a number of contributors to this volume over the course of the afternoon, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions yourself. You'll notice, I will point out that imperfect automatically generated subtitles are available by clicking the CC button, which is just at the bottom of the webinar screen. So please do avail yourself of those if you'd like. And I'll provide you with some information as to how you can go about getting a copy of this book in the chat in just a moment as well. Just a few quick procedural details. After all the presentations today, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. You'll notice there's a Q&A box just at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to write any questions you might have in that Q&A box, and we'll get to them as time permits. There is also a live chat activated, so if you have any comments or anything you might like to say, all positive commentary on the presentations, please feel free to write those in the chat, and I'll be sure to pass those along to today's participants when we come to the end of the afternoon. Now, I have the great pleasure of introducing the editor from the Prairie Garden to say a few words, and that would be Evelyn Lundeen. Evelyn, if you'd care to join us.
Hi, thanks for joining us all this afternoon. We've come a long way from the nice warm green days of summer, but I hope that you've been all able to settle in nicely for the afternoon with a nice hot cup of cocoa, or perhaps a pre-holiday glass of cider, and then join us on this cloudy and chilly November afternoon. I want to start by thanking, first of all, John Taves and McNally Robinson for all your work in helping us to celebrate the launch of the Prairie Garden 2023. This is our 84th year, and I'm gratified to see so many of you in our virtual audience. It's especially nice to see some of our contributors from so far away. Let's move on to the next slide. We go back a really long way. Aside from 3 years, I guess, during the Second World War, we've published every year continuously since 1937. We started off as the annual report and yearbook from the Winnipeg Horticultural Society, which disbanded sometime in 1957. And after that, we started publishing as the Prairie Garden. Next slide. From the very beginning, the Prairie Garden has been edited, published, and marketed by a group of nonprofit volunteers. And this is the name of our committee for this year. This is my first year as editor, and I want to first send out my heartfelt thanks to everyone on the committee for all their help in making sure that I came through this in one piece. I also want to send out a very, very special thank you to our graphic designer, John Toyne, with me being editor for the very first year. I'm sure I must have caused him some frustrating moments during the course of getting the book together. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide then. Okay, the fact that our book continues to be successful after 84 years probably has something to do with the fact that we deal specifically with cool climate and the short season gardening zones that are spread across both the Canadian prairies and the Great Plains of the US, and the dedicated writers who are writing about these zones. We have many authors like Colleen Zacharias, who has been unendingly supportive of me over this past year, and others as well as people like Carl Durand, who went out of his way to find an alternate version of a map that I needed to use. And then there's many others as well, including people like Carl's father, Rick Durand, Philip Ronald, Tiffany Grankow, Cheryl Normando, and Sarah Williams, all of whom put their trust in me and allowed me to use and edit their work. I also wanted to extend our thanks to some of our first-time authors, like Mary Veldman, who is from the lovely Beausejour Daily Gardens, and Lee Goodfellow, who is way out on the West Coast there, who taught us a little bit about holiday cacti. I'd love to be able to mention the names of everybody, but unfortunately we'd be here all afternoon and into the evening if I did that. Okay, we'll just move on to the next slide now. And speaking of climate, I guess that brings us nicely to our chosen theme and our cover for this year's edition of Climate Aware Gardening. If you look at our index, you'll see that we have 55 articles for you this year, along with a number of what we call fillers and articles that deal with general horticultural themes. 34 of those articles deal directly with our chosen subject, which of course is climate change. 21 of these are the generalized horticultural ones, and the remainders are short fillers, as we refer to them, on brief subjects like how to grow bigger tomatoes in nursery pots, along with an amusing Greek myth that looks at how some of the seasons were changed. And on the next slide, before we begin our look at climate aware gardening, I just want to briefly mention our upcoming theme for next year. Again, we'll move on to the next slide, indoor gardening. And if we move on to the next slide there, it'll show you some potential ideas for our theme for coming up for next year. If you have any ideas for a potential article, I'd be pleased to hear from you. And you can just contact me at editor@theprairiegarden.ca, and my email address is listed on the next slide as well. Next, I'd like to introduce to you or tell you a little bit about Danny Blair. He is our guest editor for this edition. Danny is a well-known climatologist and a professor at the University of Winnipeg, where he moderates the Climate Atlas for Canada. And he is also a professor in their geography department, whose research focuses on climate change, specifically that occurring on the prairies. Before introducing Danny formally, I also want to send out one more shout out to some of our other academic authors who also contributed to our edition. So thanks to people like the doctors John Gavlowski, Jason Gibbs, Mary Vetter, David Sauchin, and Diana Robson, among many others. And Danny, I guess we'll give the floor to you now.
Thank you, Evelyn. Appreciate that. And before I begin, I do want to extend my appreciation to everybody on the Prairie Garden Committee for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful book. I'm very proud of the content. It's marvelous, and the committee has been very kind to me. They work so hard. We met once a month virtually, unfortunately, but it was a good times, and I was continue to be so impressed with your dedication and your knowledge, your expertise. I learned so much through this exercise, and certainly from the book and the many editions that I bought since you've invited me to be on the committee. I am a gardener. I'm nowhere near a master gardener, but I try hard. And because from what I've learned over the last year or so working with you and from the books, I'm sure I will be a better gardener going forward. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen here. And thank you for the opportunity to speak about climate change. I take every opportunity that I have to talk to people about climate change. It is my passion. It is my number one priority as a professor, as a researcher, to get the message out about climate change. I could go on for hours, but I shan't. But let's see how long it takes for me to get through this. What I want to do is talk about the cause of climate change briefly, and end up with talking about what the implications are for gardening on the prairies. And of course, when we talk about climate change in the prairies or anywhere around the globe, we need to talk about carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is the #1 contributor to the climate change that we're experiencing right now. And as you all know, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up, and it continues to go up and will continue to go up quite dramatically. Here's a slide that shows my dad being born in 1922. Well, that's not him being born, but that's my dad. And he was born in 1922 in Indian Head, Saskatchewan. And my mom was born in 1933 in Yellowgrass, Saskatchewan. So I grew up in Regina. I'm a proud Saskatchewanian. And I've been in Manitoba since 1983 and very happy to be here. It's been very good to me. But notice in 1922, when my dad was born, the carbon dioxide concentration was 303 parts per million, which means only 303 of a million molecules on average were carbon dioxide when dad was born. And when mom was born in Yellowgrass, it was 307. So it had gone up a little bit. But notice that for most of that graph there, which goes back to 1700, the carbon dioxide was close to 280 parts per million. And the Industrial Revolution has changed everything. And if I go to my next slide, there I am when I'm 12 years old in 1969. There I am, a little science nerd, happy to be a science nerd. It's taken me a long ways and given me a very good life. When I was 12, the carbon dioxide concentration was already 324 parts per million. And if I continue the slide, in 2017, when I met my lovely partner, Laurel, on the bus, on the number 66 bus, the carbon dioxide concentration for the world as a whole was 407. And so throughout my lifetime, the carbon dioxide has gone up 32%. I'm 65 years old. The concentration of carbon dioxide has gone up 32% in those 65 years, and 48% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's 416 or so now, and going up by 2 or 3 parts per million every year. And therein lies the problem. The concentration of carbon dioxide continues to go up and is going to continue to go up for a long time. The question is, which way is it going to go? How high is it going to go? It's going up, of course, because of our use of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have given us wonderful lifestyles, but there's a cost to them. They're very energy-rich compounds and relatively cheap and easy to use. The burning of coal, oil, gas, cement production produces a lot of carbon dioxide, the process of making cement to make concrete. Gas flaring from oil wells and so forth and refineries gives off carbon dioxide. Fossil fuels are the main contributor to carbon dioxide. So as all of you know, we hear so much in the news these days about reducing our emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, and this is why, because carbon dioxide is the big contributor. Thank goodness, not all of that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere. About 48% of the carbon dioxide that we release stays in the atmosphere. Plants and soil sequester about 30%. So thank goodness for growing plants and forests and crops and jungles and so forth. We need those plants that use carbon dioxide, of course, in their photosynthetic processes, and the soils that can keep those carbon compounds. We need those in a big way. We need to keep those soils and keep those plants healthy. The ocean also takes up a large amount of that carbon dioxide. But as I say, about half of the carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere. And it has produced the kind of changes that we're seeing in the atmospheric system. And of course, I'm referring to the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases allow sunlight to come in relatively unimpeded. The atmosphere is relatively transparent to sunlight. The carbon dioxide is relatively transparent to sunlight and the atmosphere as a whole. But the Earth light, the infrared radiation that the Earth tries to emit to keep a balance, is inhibited by the greenhouse gases. They absorb some of that infrared radiation that's trying to get out, and they send it back towards the surface, and that's the greenhouse effect. We've unbalanced the system. The system is no longer in balance. There's more radiation coming in than going out, and that's why we have global warming and the climate change that results from that global warming. So the reason we hear so much about reducing our greenhouse gases is because we want to keep the system as unbalanced as possible, because the more it is balanced, the more change we see around the world and in the prairies, of course. Because of those carbon dioxide emissions being staying in the atmosphere and not all of it being sequestered into the oceans or into the plants and soil, the temperature has risen in the world. And in fact, the world has warmed up by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial. And by pre-industrial, I mean the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. If we use that as the standard, as normal, if you will, we've warmed the world up by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. That doesn't seem like very much to a lot of people, but it is a large amount of change in a short period of time. The world is always changing. The climates are always changing. Not very often do they change this rapidly. And all of the things that we hear about climate change, all of the terrible weather around the world, the extreme events, the melting of glaciers, the rising of sea levels, all of that is associated with only 1.1 degrees Celsius. And as we'll see in a little while here, there's more warming coming, and therefore there's more of that coming, more of the undesirable consequences of climate change, the heat waves, the floods, the droughts, the sea level rises, the glacial disappearances, and so forth. All of that is going to happen even more so in the future. A lot of it already with 1.1, but there's more coming, unfortunately. We have to try hard to reduce our emissions to keep it down as much as possible. So these last 50 years in particular have seen a rather striking rise in the average global temperature. And that has occurred in the prairies as well. But it's, as I say, only the beginning, because if we continue to emit carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases, but especially carbon dioxide in the quantities that we are, we're going to see some very high temperatures. And of course, I'm talking about the climate models. The climate models show us what we should expect. They're projections. They're not, cut and hard and fast forecasts. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but the climate models do a really good job of simulating the past climates and the current climates, and therefore we should pretty much rely on making good projections of what the climate is going to be like in the future. And in a while, you'll see me talk about the high carbon scenario and the low carbon scenario. The high carbon scenario is essentially what we're doing now. That is, if we really continue what we're doing now, emitting about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year from the burning of fossil fuels. At the end of this century, we're going to have an average global temperature that is about 3 or 4 degrees higher than it is right now. 3 or 4 more degrees of warming if we burn. If we become more sensible and lower our emissions to a target that is, it could be better, but it's attainable, the world's temperature may only warm up from today's about 1 or 2 more degrees. Even that is a lot of warming in a very short period of time, and there's consequences for that. Most of them not very good, unfortunately, for us and for other people around the world. Every additional degree of warming, or 1/10 of a degree of warming, results in larger and larger changes. And in particular in Canada. So here we see 3 graphs, or 3 maps rather, that show what the average global temperature will be, or how it's distributed around the world, if the world warms up 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, or let's hope not 4 degrees. And the colors indicate the temperature changes in those regional components. So notice the dark reds are 5, 6, 7 degrees of warming. And that's what we see in Canada. Canada is on the front lines, if you will, of climate change. When the world warms up by some amount, Canada warms up more. And in fact, Canada is warming at about double the global rate, and will continue to do so in the coming decades, according to the climate models. That is, if you hear a forecast or a projection that the world is going to warm up 3 degrees, then that means 6 degrees for Canada. Canada's geography, Canada's particular location in the general circulation system, in the atmospheric system, in the mid latitudes and high latitudes, forces climate change, warming in particular, to be exacerbated in our part of the world. And in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic, it's about 3 times. So if you hear that the world is expected to warm up by 3 degrees, then that's 9 degrees for the Arctic. And of course, that's an enormous amount of change. And again, in a very short period of time, decades. And of course, there are consequences to that. The loss of sea ice, the loss of habitat for polar bears and other ice-dependent animals, and biodiversity losses, changes to cultural practices and so forth. Opportunities for sure, opening up of the ocean for transportation is an opportunity for business, but there's a cost to every business as well. So we in Canada are feeling and are going to continue to feel climate change more so than much of the world. The consequences in other parts of the world can be worse, of course, because we are relatively rich in Canada and can be prepared and get prepared. Other people are much more vulnerable. So as I want to do, I need to show you some graphs, some more graphs. And in particular, I want to show you here the observed and projected temperatures for Winnipeg. And to those of you who aren't in Winnipeg, this book is targeted at the prairies, the prairie provinces in North Dakota and Northwestern Ontario as well, to some degree. So I apologize for concentrating on my hometown here of Winnipeg, but I have all this data for all of Canada if you ever want it. Here I'm showing the change in the observed change and the projected change in the average annual minimum temperature for Winnipeg. So these black lines here, are actual observations at weather stations in and around Winnipeg, within 50 kilometers of Winnipeg. I took all the weather stations around Winnipeg and plotted them on the same graph. And as you can see, there's a trend in the last 50, 60 years in the average annual minimum temperature. It's measurable. Climate change is measurable in Winnipeg. It's observable. And if we go back to the late 1800s, you can see that it was a lot colder back then than it was now. And so that even longer term temperature change is quite dramatic. The red and blue lines are the projections for the average annual minimum temperature in Winnipeg based upon the climate model data that we use at the Prairie Climate Centre. We use 24 different climate models. These show the averages for those 24 models. If we follow the high carbon scenario, this is what the average minimum temperature in Winnipeg is expected to be like as we approach the end of the century. And this is what it's like if we follow the lower carbon scenario. If the world, including Canada and you and me, if we really get serious about reducing our emissions of all sorts, we can keep the temperature down. It won't go as high. And that is something that you'll see over and over again here. Here is the average fall maximum temperature for Winnipeg. And so the autumn maximum temperature. And again, you can see that if we continue the way we are, we expect very different temperatures in the fall. And so too in the winter. And I think most of us who've lived on the prairies can remark quite easily that winters aren't the way they used to be. And indeed, the temperatures in Winnipeg and across the prairies have increased quite a bit. Of course, as you as gardeners all know, that there's an enormous amount of variability in our crazy climate. There is an enormous amount of interannual variability. One winter can be very cold and the next winter can be very warm. It's a natural part of our climate in the mid latitudes here in North America. And even more so as the world gets warmer. But winters are going to continue to get warmer, projected to get warmer, and especially under the high carbon scenario. I bring your attention to this winter. The winter of 1877-78 is almost off the chart, very out of character for that time of our history. There was this super El Nino event around the world that killed millions of people, unfortunately, in Asia from drought. In Winnipeg here, it produced a very, very warm winter. The average maximum temperature was about -2 degrees for December, January, February, a very, very warm winter. That can happen again. And so if we were to superimpose that big El Nino on this year, we would have very high temperatures perhaps in the wintertime in the future. And then the spring temperatures have increased as well. Again, lots of interannual variability, but we're headed towards, whether under the high carbon scenario or the low carbon scenario, more warming in the spring at all times of the year, and including the summer. The summer has been getting a lot of attention lately because of the heat waves, the really high temperatures. You'll recall last year, Canada hit a new record high temperature of 49.6 degrees Celsius in Lytton, BC, and that broke the previous record of 45 degrees in Yellowgrass, Saskatchewan. My mom was there for the previous, she was 4 years old. In Yellowgrass, she experienced the former record, which was 45 degrees Celsius in Yellowgrass in Mydale, Saskatchewan. And if everything continues the way that the climate models tell us, we're going to see a lot of record temperatures if we follow the high carbon scenario and even the lower carbon scenario. And notice again, just visually, but I can show you statistically as well, there's been a significant rise in the average maximum temperatures in Winnipeg. Let's move on. So the message there is temperatures have increased across the prairies in all seasons, especially winter so far, but all the others are warming up as well. And the projections are for them to get warmer, especially under the higher carbon scenario, but even under the lower carbon scenario. Precipitation, of course, is an important variable for gardening. Precipitation, as you all know, is much more difficult to forecast than temperatures. Forecasts of precipitation are much less reliable than temperature forecasts, and that's the case with climate models as well. But generally, the climate models tell us that it's going to get wetter everywhere across Canada, except slightly drier in southern Canada, especially in the summertime. All seasons in the prairies are expected to get wetter, except the summer is expected or projected to get a little bit drier. Again, there's some uncertainty that, but especially with the high carbon scenario, in the summer, southern Canada, including the prairies, is expected a little bit drier. And that's shown here from a map from the Climate Atlas of Canada produced by the Prairie Climate Centre at the University of Winnipeg. The brown is showing that there's a decline in precipitation, a slight decline in precipitation as a percentage compared to recently across southern Canada under the high carbon scenario, less so with the lower carbon scenario. But even a slight decrease of precipitation in the summers and the prairie times is quite significant, because a lot of that precipitation, of course, doesn't stay on the surface or in the soil or in the plants. It gets evapotranspired into the atmosphere. And this is why, as you'll see, and as many of you know, and many of the writers in the book talk about the increasing threat of drought in the prairies in the future, drought becomes more likely if there's more evaporation and transpiration with the higher temperatures, especially if the precipitation declines even a little bit. And so some significant changes to precipitation, generally wetter, but drier in the summertime, perhaps, especially under the high carbon scenario. And if I quickly here look at some graphs of precipitation again in Winnipeg, here we have a graph of the annual precipitation in Winnipeg as recorded by all the stations near Winnipeg. And of course, you see enormous amounts of variability. I'm sure some of you remember the really wet summers in the 1990s. Last year, of course, this is 2021. Last year was very dry in Winnipeg, and we don't have the 2022 dot on the map here yet, but it's going to be somewhere up here because we're into the 700s. We have already created the wettest, we've already recorded at the airport the wettest amount of annual precipitation in a calendar year, and we still have a month and a half to go. So that's a kind of a signature in our climate. One year can be really dry, and the very next one could be very wet. One year can be very cold, the next one be very warm. It's a wacky climate, and of course that's a challenge to everybody who is vulnerable to the changes in the weather, including all of you gardeners. And of course, last year in 2021, we had the driest July on record. This year wasn't quite so dry. We had 85.6 at the airport this past July, but only 8.5 millimeters at the airport in last July, 2021. Enormous amounts of variability, of course. A challenge for everybody, as I said. April, as was noted by some in the book, this past April was really quite remarkable. 118 millimeters this year at the airport in April, surpassed only by 1896, which had 143. Winnipeg has data going back to 1873. Crazy climate. The spring, of course, was very wet. That was a challenge for many. Of course, the farming community got onto the land quite late, and 2022, 299 millimeters at the airport, a really challenging spring. And in the summertime, lots of variability, and I'll just continue here. This is the message we're trying to get out at the Prairie Climate Centre, especially through our flagship product, the Climate Atlas of Canada, which is a very interactive website. If I'll just flip back here, the address for it is right there, climateatlas.ca. We've been around since about 2015, and we've produced a very high quality, interactive, user-friendly, data-rich website where no matter where you are in Canada, you can click on the map and find out what the climate models say your climate is expected to be like in the future. And this particular screenshot here is showing the change in the length of the frost-free season, which of course is of interest to the gardening community. And as all of you know, the frost-free season on average is getting longer and has got much longer since the late 1800s, and will continue to do so with climate change. The climate models clearly tell us that as the climate warms in the prairies, the frost-free season will be longer. And of course, that's a benefit. That's a positive, right? In fact, I must say it's very often one of the few benefits I can think up to talk about with climate change. The frost-free season is longer, and there's benefits for agriculture in particular for that, but there are some challenges as well. Winnipeg, according to our map, to our atlas, goes from 131 frost-free days in 1976-2005 to 169 in the years 2051 to 2080, which is an increase of 38 days. That's an opportunity for gardening and for agriculture, of course. But unfortunately, as I say, there are some negatives, some challenges. And here we're looking at the number of plus 30 days, hot days, plus 30 days in the summertime. Currently, Winnipeg gets about 14 days in an average summer of plus 30. This year, we only had 8, I think. Last year, we had 35. Near the end of the century, the average will be over 50 days of plus 30 in the summertime. And of course, that raises the specter of drought. The increased temperatures, even with modest precipitation, will cause much of that precipitation to be lost to evapotranspiration, unless the soil and the landscape is managed properly and the water is managed properly. So weeks more of plus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures. And I must reiterate, these are under the high carbon scenario. I'm showing that to be a bit dramatic, of course. Under the low carbon scenario, they go up less, but they still go up, and by a lot. And at the other end of the spectrum is the loss of cold days. The one reason why the winters are why the growing season is getting longer is the winters are getting shorter and less severe, and so we see we're seeing and going to continue to see many fewer cold days in the wintertime. Winnipeg goes from about a dozen right now to about 1 near the end of the century, and this is generally thought of as a good thing, right? But heating bills and psychological and physical stress, but there's a cost to not having those cold temperatures in the wintertime that creates snow and snowpack and moisture regeneration in the spring, and let alone the impacts upon wildlife and recreation and culture and all those kind of things. And the reason, of course, the reason why we're expecting to see many more hot days and many fewer cold days is that a simple shift in the average temperature by a degree or two causes a disproportionate increase in the number of hot days and a loss of the cold days. The tail end of the normal distribution of temperatures observed in our part of the world, when you shift that bell curve to the right, when you shift it to the right, even just a little bit, you dramatically increase the number of hot days and you dramatically decrease the number of cold days. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And that's exactly what we're going to see in the years ahead. Now, for those of you who had a chance to look at the book already, there's the main article that I contributed to it was about, included a discussion of the migration of climates from the United States towards us, thermal climate migration. I've created on the Climate Atlas website, there's a page called Climate Analogs. The address is at the top there, and it's in the book. And on the page here, I describe what climate analogs are, and there's a detailed methodology how I did it. But what I did was I took climate data from the Climate Atlas for 79 locations across the prairies. Hopefully, it's a town that's of interest, but even a nearby town would be similar. And I calculated or identified all the United States stations. There's about 6,000 stations in the United States south of us for which I have really good climate data. And I found all those current US weather stations that currently have weather that we're projected to have in the future. And I mapped them in these beautiful maps. They're complicated. I hope you get a chance to look at them when you buy 2 or 3 or 4 copies of the book and study them. And what they show is that for these 15-year periods, on the right here, color-coded, I show which US stations currently have those temperatures that we're projected to have in Winnipeg. And again, I'm highlighting Winnipeg here. So on this particular map, these red dot stations here are United States stations now that we are projected to have the temperatures for, and we're looking at the July maximum temperatures here, in the year 2081 to 2095. Those red stations are stations that currently have the weather, if you will, the maximum temperatures in July that we're projected to have near the end of the century. And so if you think about that, what this map is showing is that over time, the climates of the United States are migrating towards the south, towards the north. The climates of the United States are migrating towards the north. This is already happening, and it's going to continue to happen, whether under the high carbon scenario or under the low carbon scenario. So what I created is, I don't know, I think it's 1,000 maps for all those 79 stations. I did it for every month, for every season, and the year as a whole. Please feel free to browse through them, print them up, whatever. Ask me for help if you need some help understanding them. But I'm trying to show how the seasons, the temperatures are monthly and seasonally in particular are expected to migrate and already have migrated towards the north. Here we see the average maximum temperatures under the high carbon scenario for the fall. So in the 2080s, these places down here in northern Nebraska, for example, that's the kind of climate we're expected to have in 2081, 2095. And here's the winter temperatures. The winter doesn't look as dramatic geographically because you don't have to go very far south to find pretty warm temperatures. In fact, that's 8 degrees of warming from 1991 to 2081. That's 8.8 degrees of warming for Winnipeg under the high carbon scenario. The spring temperatures, we see the same thing. Places to the south of us, in South Dakota and northern Nebraska, that's the kind of climate we're expected to have in the spring for average maximum temperatures under the high carbon scenario. And the summers is the one that really catches my eye and I find quite fascinating. In the summertime, the average maximum temperatures, again, under the high carbon scenario, we're expected to have in Winnipeg, projected to have temperatures that are currently found in Kansas. And I think all of us, the value, I think, of climate analogs is we all have in our mind what that means. It's a very different climate down in Nebraska and Kansas and Missouri and even South Dakota and not too far south of us, it's much warmer. And under the low carbon scenario, there's less change. And that's telling me, and I hope it tells you, we should try to keep our low carbon down, keep the carbon down as low as possible, because it means less change, less migration of climates, those hot climates to the south towards the north. Of course, what that's all saying is the plant hardiness zones are migrating. The plant hardiness zones, no matter how you calculate them, whether you use the American system or the Canadian system or the various Canadian system, those are all migrating towards the north and are going to continue to do so, especially if we have really high carbon emissions in the coming years, less so if we have lower carbon emissions. And the consequences of that are profound. The changes we're going to see are warmer winters, shorter winters, longer, hotter summers, more frequent heat waves, more frequent droughts, more intense rainfalls. An energized climate system, a hotter climate system will generally have more intense rainfalls. We're already seeing that. We're still going to have winter. We're still going to have some bitterly cold polar vortex events once in a while, so we always have to be on guard for those. We're going to continue to see the migration of climates from the south towards us, and even more variability. Our climate, as I've indicated there many times in my scribbles, what a crazy, wonderfully variable climate we have. Well, even more so in the future. It becomes even more variable according to the climate models in the future. And once in a while, things are going to happen that are just going to surprise us in terms of extreme temperatures, high temperatures, intense rainfalls, storms, snow in October or earlier, perhaps. There's a lot of change coming, and especially with the larger emissions. The implications for you and I as gardeners is also quite profound. Some of it positive, some of it not. We'll have to change to more viable varieties for the future climate, more resilient varieties that can withstand a wide variety of conditions in terms of moisture and heat and cold and dryness. Of course, pests, as it's discussed in the book by at least a couple authors. Some pests are going to love this heat and changing climate. Others are going to perhaps be pushed away, but pest management will become even more so an issue in the future as we see the climate zones shift. Your design of your garden, of your landscaping, will have to become resilient as well. And again, there's some really nice articles in there to talk about how to build a garden that's resilient to the extremes of our crazy climate and getting crazier climate. Long-term planning will become important, especially if you're planting trees, of course. Soil management, as is discussed so well by some articles, it will become even more important to sequester that carbon in the soil as much as possible, to keep that soil healthy, to be resilient to those extremes. And of course, we should always, and many of you already are, very sensitive to reducing your carbon emissions by choosing the right kind of garden equipment or pots or all the materials that we use in our gardening, whether it be a large operation or a small operation. And of course, we should be growing food more than we do in our gardens. We're seeing a move towards that, in part because of inflation, the cost of food. But we're going to continue to see that. And of course, we need to encourage young people to get involved in gardening because it'll become even more important for them. Gardeners can lead by example. Gardeners do lead by example, by showing what can be done with a little effort and with a lot of love and a lot of joy. You can have a really rewarding experience and a profitable experience and an important contribution to the problem at hand. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening. As I said, I could go on, and maybe I did there, but I welcome any questions you might have, but I'll turn it back to John.
Oh, and I will invite Evelyn back, who I believe will be introducing the next participant this evening, or the afternoon, rather.
Thanks, Danny, for a fascinating presentation, and hopefully we can learn a lot from what you talked about this afternoon. and change our gardens to make sure that we can survive the issues that are going to come up with climate change in the coming decades. Moving on now, our next presenter is Linda Dietrick. And Linda is going to be talking to us about changes in expected gender roles related to how we view insects and how that's changed over the last couple of decades. Linda, of course, is a past editor of the Prairie Garden. She is a retired professor of the German language at the University of Winnipeg, and she is also a master gardener. So, Linda, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Evelyn. Just sharing my screen. Oh, wrong one. Sorry. There we go. Well, thank you, Evelyn. Most of you probably buy the Prairie Garden every year because of the straight up gardening information that it provides you. Reliable, timely garden advice, totally geared to our challenging prairie conditions. But ever since its beginnings in 1937, the Prairie Garden has always made a little bit of room for other things besides that, things like horticultural history, personal writing, and even humor, which pretty much describes this piece. I am grateful that it was accepted. Maybe its acceptance has to do with, also had to do with the fact that in the midst of all of these dire reminders of climate change, it offers what the title says, a little bit of good news. Many of us are old enough to remember when this was how ladies were expected to react to mice. Ladies were supposed to be horrified at mice, and actually horrified at any sort of small rodent, insect, or invertebrate that was classified as vermin. Of course, they were never as depicting gentlemen jumping on chairs and shrieking in horror. The eek reaction was obviously the symptom of a specifically feminine hypersensitivity to such things, or at least that was the message that I remember picking up as a young girl. And, well, thank goodness that modern chemistry could come to the rescue. I used to teach cultural history at the University of Winnipeg, among other things. And as a good second wave feminist, I've always been interested in the history of gender roles. Feminine squeamishness towards invertebrates was also part of children's literature going back to the 1800s. We all know about Little Miss Muffet and her tuffet and the spider who frightened her away. The rhyme was actually first recorded in 1805, and thereafter was frequently included in Mother Goose books for children, with great illustrations like this one. This is from the year 1915, as you can see. Again, let me ask you, do you think anybody would have imagined, say, Little Boy Blue getting scared off by a spider in the same way? Here's a humorous vintage postcard from Germany that I purchased from an online dealer. The message on the back shows it was mailed in an Austrian village in 1919 by a boy named Peter to what looks like a young female friend or maybe a relative by the name of Finel. Now, what is it that made this charming and funny for people, I ask you? A little boy torments a little girl with flying beetles that he has obviously collected in a cigar box. Did people laugh at this because they felt this behavior was typical for boys and girls? Humor often works with stereotypes. It confirms what we think we already know, right? Today, maybe we would say to ourselves, oh, that little boy is just trying to bug his sister, his little sister. Yes, he's bugging her, right? That's what we say in English, not in German. That's what we say in English, don't we? As if we agreed already that all bugs are bad things. Here's an old Dennis the Menace cartoon from 1954 that I remember seeing as a kid. You remember Margaret, the neighbor girl. She does seem a little bit less than amused. And of course, she has the doll. She has the frilly underpants and crinoline skirt that mark her as a little girl. Again, I mean, can we imagine the roles reversed? I don't think so. However, in 1966, Hank Ketchum would go on to publish a comic book that had Margaret teaching Dennis about caterpillars and butterflies. To me, I mean, that suggests maybe the beginnings of the shift that I want to talk about. But to return to the world of advertising, if you're as ancient as I am, you will remember how in the 50s and 60s, ads for domestic pesticides were especially targeted at women, specifically mothers and housewives. No muss, no fuss, just press the button and your home will be safe, it'll be clean and insect-free. Every housewife's goal. In fact, historians have shown that ever since the early 20th century, public health experts had been enlisting housewives as the first line of defense against germs and the insects that can carry them. So of course the ads targeted women. And this ad is especially hair-raising, I think, because what is it for? It's for DDT. The woman says, I can't think how I ever managed without this super fly spray. She's beautiful, she has perfect teeth, and she's wearing a perfectly clean white lace collar to suggest that she is, in that way, perfectly in charge of her household and its cleanliness. And she adds in the smaller copy there, what a war I used to wage against flies. In fact, the synthetic organic insecticide DDT first came into wide use during World War II, and it remained a popular household spray until the 1960s. Not surprisingly, the culturally reinforced horror felt by women towards insects was enlisted to sell it and other domestic pesticides. As this USDA poster from 1943 suggests, insecticides were understood to be like an extension of the wartime arsenal, and women were supposed to fight in their own way on the home front. It really wasn't until Rachel Carson's book of 1962, Silent Spring, that people began to recognize that DDT was not a miracle solution. We know now that it persists in the food chain and causes serious physiological damage to animals and people. It was finally phased out in Canada in the 1970s, although other pesticides took its place. Given this history, it should not surprise you at all to learn that from the mid-40s until the late 60s, almost every issue of the Prairie Garden recommended DDT for the garden. This is an ad for Green Cross flower spray containing DDT, as you can see. It's from 1950. It promises compliments for your blooming beauties if you use it. However, I want to stress that the most important thing I learned from going through old issues of the Prairie Garden was that there was a huge change that happened. Somewhere between the early 70s and the mid 80s, there was a shift in attitudes, a positive shift, a clear trend away from regarding chemical extermination as normal and necessary, and towards a more benign view of insects and a recognition of their benefits. For example, they can control other pests and pest insects. Many of them are predator insects, and they are food for a myriad number of other animals, including birds and their babies. And here's an example of the shift from 1988, a 1988 article by Wendy Mackey describing the first successful year of biological pest control at the University of Winnipeg greenhouse. And actually, the Prairie Garden has not recommended chemical pesticides since the 1990s. Times have changed. I follow a Facebook group set up for beginning gardeners where they can ask questions to be answered by more experienced gardeners. And last summer, that's 2021, I saw a picture like this posted in that Facebook group with, it was from a woman, and she was basically freaking out. It was like, ew, what is this thing on my parsley? The first person to reply asked, are you joking? She was not. And so what happened was some really kind and patient people explained to her that this was just a baby butterfly and how it was going to transform itself into a black swallowtail. And the woman was like, oh, okay. And since then, more and more, I've been seeing gardeners, and especially women gardeners, posting pictures like that on Facebook so that they can brag. They brag about, as they say, all of the cats on their plants. And girls are raised differently now, I do believe. My dental hygienist, for instance, always tells me stories about her daughter's adventures in their backyard, searching for insects, searching for caterpillars and worms and so on, building terrariums for them. Also our next door neighbor's little girl learned how to walk by toddling around in their yard with a doll stroller, but she wasn't taking any dollies for a walk. She was perambulating around with a collection of worms and beetles in her, well, buggy. And one day she was standing in the yard and wailing her head off for some reason. Her mother walked over, pointed at the ground and said, "Oh, look, a bug." And in that very instant, the little girl stopped crying and crouched down to see. Thank you. Back to you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Linda, for a very entertaining talk. And speaking of DDT, that actually reminds me of when I was a small little girl growing up in the 1960s. I grew up in Portage Prairie. Back in those days, they used to fog for DDT during the daytime. And I remember all the neighborhood children would follow the DDT truck as it would spew this cloud of DDT out. And it was always considered to be great fun to run around smack right in the middle of all of that cloud of smoke. And I can just imagine what the levels of DDT in the bodies of some of these children must have been. And I have to qualify here that I never ever did that because I could never stand the smell of that stuff. But that just goes to show you how things have changed over the decades, where children were allowed to be exposed to something like DDT as being quite normal back during the 1960s. We're going to finish off our set of presentations now, and Sandra Venton is going to be speaking to us about one of the most beautiful of our springtime shrubs, and those are the peonies. So Sandy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Evelyn. Well, what can I say about peonies? They're my love. I have several loves. Peonies are one of them, lilies, roses, whatever. These are some peonies that I've grown. So most of them are from my garden. I just wanted to say, if you don't know peonies, even if you have never heard of one, you've probably seen them. They're in old farmyards, they're in graveyards, they're in homesteads. And those are the herbaceous peonies, the ones that your grandmother, your parents actually grew. And I love them. And then I found out that there was something called an Ito peony. And that's a cross between a tree peony and a herbaceous peony. And I fell in love all over again. So I wanted to say that they were my first love, but they have most definitely found a way to my heart. And they just get bigger and bigger. So they're herbaceous. And then there were the trees. And the trees weren't really grown here at all until a couple of years ago, when people found that, oh, wait a minute, maybe we can grow them. Well, we not only can grow them, we can actually start them from seed, and I've been doing that. I have seedlings. I'm going to have to start hanging from chandeliers because I'm running out of room. There's about 9 seedlings from 2 years ago. There's 4 big, huge trees in my garden. And the nice thing about it is to start them from seed. They're hardy. They don't have a graft. You don't have to bury the graft. You don't have to worry if they're going to die down or whatever. And there's the Ito peonies. And the Ito peonies are the crosses. And they are some of the most beautiful peonies of all. Expensive as the dickens, but they're really great. Anyway, I do grow all 3 types. I have no favorites, but if I see it, I want it. I can't say enough about the peonies, whether they're herbaceous, tree, or intersectional. They laugh at our winters. And they managed to not only survive, but thrive during the hot, dry summers that we've been having. They just carry on, minding their own business, not getting into the way of any other plants, as they're not considered even slightly invasive. And thanks to their very large and sturdy root systems, and I'm talking about herbaceous and Ito peonies here, they can take whatever is given weather-wise and care-wise. If it's a drought of a year, so what? They don't care. And the same goes for the fernleaf peonies. The fernleaf peonies are totally different than any of the other peonies. They don't have a big thick root. They've got a small fine root. And if you dig one up, it'll fall into pieces. And each piece is a new fernleaf peony. And actually, that was the very first peony that I ever saw, that I ever fell in love with, and that I always wanted. And the nice thing about them is they also sneer at our inclement weather, and they carry on through winter as though the winter and weather was perfectly balmy, snow cover or no snow cover. So I must say, though, that a large number of people think that ants on a peony are going to destroy the buds. That's not true. They're just going for the sweet syrup that's extruded by the buds. And that's it. So a spray from the hose can usually dislodge them. The pictures that I've put out here are tree peonies, Ito peonies, and herbaceous peonies. And I'm just sorry that I haven't marked down the names of them. But as you see, they're all different, they're varying. That particular one is the fernleaf. And they love our climate. And whereas we might be jealous of people who grow crepe myrtle or magnolias or wisteria or whatever in the southern climates, they can't grow our peonies. They need the cold. They need the cold season and the winter, and that's it. So if you haven't grown any peonies, there's no time like the present. Probably 3 years ago would have probably been better, but plant one, grow one. They're not cheap, but they're easy and they'll outlast you and probably your children and your grandchildren. And that's it for me. I've enjoyed writing for the Prairie Garden. I've been doing it for years. And peonies are dear to my heart. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy, particularly for all of those absolutely beautiful photographs that you showed us of the peonies. And I think that concludes our presenters for the afternoon. I hope that you enjoyed Sandy, Linda, and also Danny's talks. We do have a short question and answer period at the end. But before we proceed on to that, I just want to mention that the book is available at the McNally Robinson bookstore, and you can also find it at our website. So if you just type in prairiegarden.ca, it will take you to the website. And please purchase the newest edition. And we also have a lot of our older editions available still. So please have a look at our website and see if you can find something that you can stuff into someone's stocking for the upcoming Christmas season. Okay, John, I'll turn it back over to you for the question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. So as indicated, we do have a few minutes for some questions from you folks. So I'll encourage all of tonight's panelists to come back, and then we'll be able to put some questions to them. A reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can also put them in the chat as I'm monitoring that as well. And just to build off your presentation, Sandy, we had a question come in during it where Mary was wondering, what tree peonies can you recommend growing here in Manitoba?
Well, there's not a lot of tree peonies that are available to be purchased here in Manitoba. We used to be able to get some from Walmart or Canadian Tire or whatever, but I noticed in the past few years they're not available. There's some specialty nurseries like Fraser's Thimble Farm in Salt Spring Island in BC. And yet they had a problem with getting their peonies from Asia this year. I've been growing tree peonies from seed. My friend Naomi and I started getting the seeds from the Canadian Peony Society, and we start them. And they worked and they bloomed. Might have 4 of them, and all 4 of them bloomed last summer, and they set seed. So I took the seeds and I planted them, and they came up. The seeds from last year. If you wanted tree peonies, Mary, it'd probably be best if you got in touch with the Canadian Peony Society, purchased the seeds, and started them yourself. They're hardy, there's no graft, and you don't have to worry about them dying back or whatever. So if that helps, I hope it does. But there's really no place in Canada that sells tree peonies unless you want to mortgage the house.
Thank you very much, Sandy. We have a few questions related to your presentation, Danny. So I'm going to start with one from Joe, who was wondering if the oceans were becoming more acidic with the progressive death of ocean organisms.
Yeah, yes, indeed. That's one of the consequences of the oceans sequestering, having carbon dioxide, large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere absorbed into the ocean. Is acidifying the oceans quite dramatically, and will continue to do so, I'm afraid. And of course, this has consequences for organisms that are sensitive to acidification, corals and mollusks and things, organisms that build shells are at risk from acidification. So there's a very serious problem going on in the oceans as a result of their ability to absorb carbon dioxide into the water itself. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Danny. We do have a follow-up from Evelyn herself, who was wondering if you could comment on the whiplash effects of high and lows within the same season. She made specific reference to the Thanksgiving storm of 2019.
Yeah, what a crazy storm that was. And a really good example of what's now called a whiplash event, where you swing from one condition to another over a very short period of time. This is happening all across much of North America. Including Canada, where because of the waviness in the jet stream is that upper level flow of air that steers our weather systems. And because of the Arctic warming so much compared to the south, it seems that this is causing wavier jet streams. If the physics of this is, if you slow down the jet stream, it becomes more wavy. If you speed it up, it becomes more less wavy. And so the theory is, and perhaps the observations, perhaps the evidence is, that the jet stream is becoming more wavy. And this means that as the jet stream moves from west to east, one day you can be in the cold air and the next day you can be in the warm air, or the reverse. And so there's a suggestion, and there seems to be an abundance of evidence building up and within the models as well, that this is something we should expect more often, more of these whiplash, these crazy back and forth events in the winter in particular, when it's or the colder shoulder seasons, when it's most noticeable, that you can be in a cold snow prone kind of event, and then it can melt, or it can be reverse. It's happening more often, and I think it's something we need to get prepared for, of course.
Oh, thank you, Danny. And with the temperature change, can we expect tornadoes to follow at all?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. When I show that we may in the coming decades we may have temperatures more like those progressively in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, even into Oklahoma. Does that mean that we're going to get the same kind of extreme weather that they have? And the honest answer is we don't really know, because tornadoes require very specific conditions. They require a large amount of instability that builds those convective clouds, those towering cumulonimbus clouds, and they also require rotation to be created within those clouds. So there's uncertainty whether or not the rotation is going to be there. The convection will certainly be there. The instability, the ability of the atmosphere to rise up rapidly and produce the storm, but will it have also that ingredient of vorticity, as they call it, spin? And there's uncertainty within the models, although I was reading an article just a couple of weeks ago that suggests that we are going to get more of that, but I think it's still very conjectural. It's worrisome, of course, but let's hope not.
Thank you, Danny.
We are already in Tornado Alley, of course, but we don't want to be in Tornado Alley proper.
Danny, can I just ask you one question?
Of course, Evelyn.
Yeah, do you have anything to say about the F5 tornado from Eli?
Yeah, well, it's a very rare event. It was Canada's first official F5 tornado, a Fujita scale tornado. It's now the enhanced Fujita scale that we use to monitor or measure the intensity of tornadoes. We've had some bad ones in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta, that's for sure. Some deadly ones in Edmonton and Regina, of course, a long time ago. I think a couple of years ago, we had the only F4 tornado in all of North America one summer. So they are a normal part of our climate. And once in a while, they hit, unfortunately, a population and have the potential of doing enormous amounts of damage. Something we always need to be prepared for. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, folks. And it looks like we have one final question, and this is for Sandy. So Sandy, is the loath a lot better than the standard herbaceous peony?
That's Ito, I think, not loath.
Oh, Ito. I'm terribly sorry. L-O-T-H is the way it's spelled?
I-T-O-H. Ito.
Oh.
Sandy, you're muted.
Sandy, you have to turn your volume on. There you go.
Terribly sorry about that. Ito, Toichi Ito, is the name of the Japanese gentleman who actually was the first to hybridize a herbaceous and a tree peony to get the Ito. An Ito tree, a peony, isn't better, but what it did is it brought the yellows into the peony world. Only tree peonies were yellow, and very few herbaceous were yellow. There's one called Gold Mine, and I think it cost $75, and I got it from Nigel for $15. And my husband ran over it with a lawnmower twice. I had to re-edge so that it gave it some space, but it's not better or worse. It has a herbaceous way of growing, and it'll spread and get huge, and it'll hold the flowers up, and they don't dangle. Some of the Chinese tree peonies, like Kinshi, there was one picture that I had. You can never see what it really looks like because it dangles. It has a very lax stem, a pedicel. So, is it better, Ito? No, but the colors, it has more varying colors. And if I had my druthers, I'd rather grow an Ito than a herbaceous. And again, they are more expensive. So there's no better or worse. Does that help?
Absolutely. Speaking as a non-gardener, shamefully, I would say yes, and thank you. Now that we've reached the end of the Q&A, I'd like to invite Ian Wise, the chair of the Prairie Garden Committee, who has some words for us. Oh, and Ian, your audio isn't coming through, I'm afraid. And while Ian is figuring out his audio, I'll just offer some closing comments that I had right now, just for reference for folks. As mentioned, copies of the Prairie Garden Committee 2023 edition, Climate Aware Gardening, are available from McNally Robinson Booksellers, where it's already selling exceedingly well. You can find it basically anywhere any books on gardening are on display in the store. So please do give us a call, visit us in person, or you can also order copies of the book online, and we'll be sure to get a copy into your hands. It's always such a huge pleasure working with the Prairie Garden, and so I believe that Ian is now good to go. Potentially? Oh, not yet. So yes, it is always such a huge pleasure working with the Prairie Garden Committee. We've been launching their books, at least I've been involved in launching their books for well over a decade now, and it's always wonderful working with them. And it's been also wonderful that we've been able to move to this virtual setting as well for the last few years when we were unable to gather in person. So thank you again for joining us. And if you do know of anybody who might benefit or enjoy watching this video, please do feel free to share it, as it'll remain archived. Any luck at all, Ian? If you go to the where there's the little microphone, there's an option of various inputs where you can select a microphone. It may just be that it's attempting to read one that isn't available or isn't working at the moment. Oh, and you are apparently connected, Ian. Oh, I'm afraid you're still not coming across though. So with that in mind, I wasn't sure if there was anybody from the committee who might like to offer any closing words or any final comments on behalf of the committee. And if there isn't, then I'll just express my most sincere gratitude. Prairie Garden activities are all available on their website, so please do visit that. And you can find out more information both about the committee, about future issues of the Prairie Garden, and back issues of the Prairie Garden as well. It also includes quite a bit of information about all the incredible people who contribute to the ongoing day-to-day activities of the committee, and of course their publications. So with that, I'll just close down the afternoon with so much gratitude to all of you folks for joining us here today, and wish you all a very good afternoon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Bye now.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.